It was a Thursday morning in the fall of 1991 when 28-year-old Briar Dunham realized that someone had drawn a target on every acre her family had ever loved. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, the kind of stationery that costs more per sheet than she spent on a week's worth of groceries. It had been wedged into the same dented mailbox her grandfather Amos had bolted to a cedar post before she was born, and it looked obscene sitting there among the seed catalogs and the electric bill. Inside was a letter from a development company called Ridgeline Partners, LLC, announcing the forthcoming construction of a world-class resort and country club on the 1,000 acres of former cattle land that wrapped around her property to the north and east. The Grandview at Shenandoah, they were calling it. The letter used words like synergy and elevated living and unparalleled guest experience. It invited her to a community information session at the town hall. It did not mention the words buyout or relocation, but Briar could read what wasn't written. She'd been reading between the lines her whole life. That was a skill her grandfather had given her, and it was about to become the most important thing she owned. Let me tell you about that orchard, because if you don't understand the orchard, you won't understand anything that comes after. Amos Dunham had planted the first trees in 1947, the year he came home from the war, with a piece of German shrapnel still lodged near his left hip and a conviction that the only sane response to what he'd seen was to grow things. He didn't plant the apples that the Agricultural Extension Office recommended. He planted the old ones, the ones his own grandmother had kept in her dooryard in the hollows of West Virginia. Albemarle pippins with their sharp, complicated bite. Arkansas blacks that came off the tree so hard you could hammer a nail with one, but after 3 months in the root cellar turned into something that tasted like spiced wine. Virginia Hewitts that nobody had heard of because nobody had bothered to remember them. Grimes Goldens that smelled so intensely of something between pineapple and honey that you could locate the tree blindfolded from 20 yards. By the time Briar was a girl, those trees were ancient and magnificent, their trunks twisted into shapes that looked like the hands of old men gripping the earth. There were over 400 of them, spread across 80 acres of gentle slope, and each variety ripened at a different time, so that from late July through the first hard frost in November, the farm was in a continuous rolling harvest. Amos had taught her every tree by name, not the variety name, but the name he'd given each individual tree, the way you'd name a horse or a dog. That big pippin at the top of the hill was General. The cluster of Arkansas blacks by the creek was the Jury. The ancient Grimes Golden near the barn, the one with the split trunk that somehow kept producing year after year, was Old Pardon. From those apples, Briar made cider. Not the cloudy, sweet stuff sold in plastic jugs at the grocery store. Real cider, pressed slow in a hand-cranked press that Amos had bought second-hand in 1952. Fermented with nothing but the wild yeast that lived on the skins of the fruit themselves, aged in oak barrels that her grandfather had charred with a blowtorch in the barn. The cider tasted like the ridge itself, like cold nights and warm days, and the particular mineral signature of water that had filtered through limestone for 1,000 years before it reached the roots. She sold it from a shed at the end of the lane, along with apple butter, dried apple rings, and vinegar so sharp and clean it could make your eyes water from across the room. She made enough to pay the taxes and keep the lights on. Barely, but barely had always been enough for a Dunham. Now, the skeptics. Every small town has them, and Harper's Station, Virginia, was no different. When the Grandview announcement went public, the town practically vibrated with excitement. A luxury resort meant jobs, meant money flowing into a place that had been slowly bleeding out for decades. The old feed store owner, Earl Kincaid, caught her arm outside the post office. "Briar, honey," he said, and she could hear the careful kindness in his voice, the tone people use when they think they're talking to someone who doesn't know what's good for them. "You know they'll offer you real money for that place, enough to set yourself up somewhere nice. You're still young. You don't have to chain yourself to those old trees." He meant well. They all meant well. They saw a young woman alone on a farm that barely broke even, surrounded by trees that were older than anyone alive, making a product that most people couldn't even categorize. They thought she was drowning and too proud to wave for help. They had no idea she was the only one in town who knew how to swim. The antagonist arrived 6 weeks after the letter. His name was Mr. Leland Voss, and he was the kind of man who had never in his life picked up something he dropped. He had people for that. He drove onto her property in a silver SUV so large and polished it looked like it belonged on another planet. He did not come to the door. He stood in her gravel drive, his Italian loafers sinking slightly into the mud, and looked at her farmhouse and her barn and her crooked, beautiful trees with an expression that suggested he was mentally calculating how much it would cost to make all of it disappear. Briar came around the side of the barn, carrying a bushel of pippins, her boots caked, her hair tied back with a piece of twine. She set the bushel down on the tailgate of her truck and waited. "Miss Dunham," he said. He had a voice like polished granite, smooth and hard at the same time. "I'm the managing director of Ridgeline Partners. I wanted to introduce myself personally and discuss the exciting future of this area." He paused, glancing at her trees as if they were weeds. "Our development will bring significant change to this valley. Heavy construction, road widening, blasting for the golf course. I want to be transparent about the impact on adjacent properties." He let that hang in the air. It was a threat dressed up as a courtesy. "I appreciate the transparency," Briar said. "We'd like to offer you a very generous acquisition package," he continued, reaching into his jacket for a folder. "Well above market value. It would allow you to purchase a comparable property elsewhere, perhaps somewhere more suited to—" He searched for the word. "Your operation." He opened the folder and showed her a number. It was more money than she'd ever seen written down in one place. It was enough to buy a house outright, to never worry about a broken water pump or a late frost again. It was freedom from every physical hardship she'd ever known. Briar looked at the number, then she looked at Old Pardon, visible through the barn door, its gnarled branches heavy with golden fruit. "Mr. Voss," she said, "these trees are 70 years old. Some of the varieties growing here don't exist anywhere else on Earth. You can't move a 70-year-old apple tree any more than you can move a mountain. The farm stays. I stay with it." His smile tightened into something that wasn't a smile at all. "Miss Dunham, I strongly encourage you to reconsider. This valley is going to change whether you participate or not. It would be a shame to find yourself on the wrong side of progress." "I appreciate you coming by," she said, picking up her bushel. It was a dismissal, and they both knew it. He was not wrong about the disruption. The construction began the following spring, and it was like living next to the end of the world. The blasting came first, deep concussive thuds that shook the ground and sent shockwaves through the root systems of her oldest trees. 3 of the heritage pippins on the north boundary dropped their fruit a full month early, the tiny green apples littering the ground like casualties. The dust was relentless, a fine beige powder that coated every leaf, every blossom, clogging the pores of the trees and dulling the waxy skins of the developing fruit. Her creek, which had run clear since before anyone could remember, turned the color of weak coffee. But the worst was the water table. When they blasted and graded the hillside for the golf course, something shifted underground. The spring that fed her creek slowed to a trickle, and the old well that watered her lower orchard dropped by 14 feet in a single summer. 14 feet. She had it measured twice because she couldn't believe it. Trees that had never been stressed in 7 decades suddenly began to show signs of drought. Leaves curling inward, bark cracking, the fruit growing smaller and harder than it should have been. Let me tell you what it's like to watch something ancient die slowly. It's not dramatic. There's no crash, no explosion. It's a leaf that should be green turning brown at the edges in July. It's a branch that doesn't bud in spring. It's the absence of something you've known your whole life. A subtraction so gradual you almost don't notice until you look up one day and realize the shape of the world has changed. Briar noticed. She noticed every single loss. Her cider suffered. The fruit from stress trees produces a different juice, thinner, more acidic, lacking the depth that comes from a tree at peace with its ground. For the first time in the history of Dunham cider, she had to dump 2 entire barrels because the taste was wrong. Not bad exactly. Just not right, not honest. She could not sell something that wasn't. The income that was already barely enough became not enough. She sold her truck and bought a rusted pickup for $800. She stopped buying meat and lived on eggs from her chickens, apples, bread, and beans. She canceled the phone line. She mended clothes that should have been rags. She did not go to the community sessions where Mr. Voss presented his gleaming architectural renderings to an adoring town. She did not ask for help. She had never asked for help, and she was not going to start now, not from people who thought she was a fool. Now, let me explain something about the inheritance she carried. It wasn't the land itself, though the land was everything. It was the knowledge embedded in the land, the intelligence stored not in any computer, but in the soil, and the wood, and the water, and the handwritten records of a man who had spent 50 years paying attention. Amos Dunham kept journals, not diaries, nothing so personal, ledgers, dozens of them, filling an entire shelf in the room off the kitchen that he'd called his office and that still smelled of pipe tobacco and linseed oil. Every journal was a year of the farm's life recorded in his small, precise handwriting, rainfall by the quarter inch, first and last frost dates, bloom times for every variety, pest observations, soil amendments, and drawings. Amos had been a gifted, meticulous draftsman, and the journals were full of diagrams, cross-sections of grafting techniques, maps of root systems he'd excavated to study, plans for projects completed, and projects only dreamed. It was in the journal from 1963 that Briar found what she needed. That year, the state had proposed running a highway through the valley, and Amos had spent months designing a response. Not a protest, not a lawsuit, a living system. He called it a shelter belt, and the plans were extraordinary. 3 rows of trees, each with a specific purpose. The outer row, fast-growing eastern red cedars and Virginia pines, dense and evergreen, a year-round wall against wind, noise, and dust. The middle row, a mix of native flowering species, redbud and serviceberry and dogwood, chosen specifically because they bloomed in sequence from March through May, providing a continuous corridor of pollen and nectar. And the inner row, deep-rooted hardwoods, white oaks, and tulip poplars, whose canopy would eventually tower over everything, creating a cathedral ceiling of shade that would cool the air and hold moisture in the soil beneath. But the genius was in the details. Amos had researched the hydrology of the ridge, and he designed the shelter belt to follow a specific contour line that would intercept groundwater runoff from higher elevations and channel it back toward his orchard. The trees themselves, once established, would act as a living pump, their roots pulling water from deep underground and releasing it through transpiration, raising the humidity and effectively creating a microclimate that was cooler, moister, and more stable than the surrounding valley. He had drawn it all out with the care of an engineer and the love of a man who understood that a farm is not a machine, but an organism. The highway was never built. The plans stayed in the journal, waiting. Briar read those pages sitting on the floor of her grandfather's office. At 2 in the morning, the November wind rattling the windows, and she wept. Not from sadness, from recognition. He had seen this coming. Not the resort specifically, but the inevitability that the outside world would eventually reach for this valley. And he had left her the answer, patient and precise, folded into a ledger on a shelf, waiting for the granddaughter he'd trusted to find it. That winter, she spent every dollar she had left, and some she borrowed against the next year's cider at the local bank, and she bought trees. Not apple trees, shelter belt trees, 600 red cedar seedlings, 400 Virginia pines, 200 each of redbud, serviceberry, and dogwood, and 50 white oaks and 50 tulip poplars that were no bigger than her forearm. The nursery delivered them on 2 flatbed trucks, and the driver looked at the stacks of bundled saplings and then at the young woman standing alone in the cold and shook his head. "That's a whole lot of planting for one person, ma'am." "I know," she said. "Now, here is the part of the story that is not romantic. Here is the part that nobody puts on a postcard or a motivational poster. For 2.5 years, Briar Dunham did nothing but dig. She dug in the frozen ground of late winter when her hands cracked and bled inside her gloves. She dug in the spring mud that sucked at her boots and tried to pull her down. She dug through the blazing Virginia summers when the heat rose off the ground in visible waves and the sweat ran into her eyes until she couldn't see. She dug alone because there was no one to help her, following her grandfather's contour map with a surveyor's precision, spacing each tree exactly as his diagrams specified. She hauled water, hundreds of gallons a day in the beginning, carried in 5-gallon buckets from the diminished creek because the well was too low to waste. She built temporary shade structures from old fence posts and burlap sacks to protect the most vulnerable seedlings. She lost trees. The first summer, nearly a quarter of the red cedars died in a drought that lasted 6 weeks, and she replaced every single one the following fall, buying the saplings with money she made selling apple butter at a roadside stand 30 miles away, because she couldn't bear to sell it in Harper's Station, where people would see her and pity her. The whispers in town were constant and unkind in the way that small-town whispers always are, dressed up as concern. "Poor Briar's gone around the bend," they said over coffee at the diner, "planting a forest when she can't even keep her orchard alive." The phrase that hurt the most, though she'd never admit it, came from Earl Kincaid, who didn't know she was standing on the other side of the feed store shelving. Amos would have taken the money, he said. He was a practical man. The girl's living in a fantasy. He was wrong about her grandfather. But he was right that there were moments when the fantasy felt like it might collapse. The worst night came in the second winter. A January ice storm coated everything in a half-inch of glass. The weight brought down branches in the orchard, old branches that had held fruit for decades. She heard them cracking in the dark, sharp rifle shot sounds that made her flinch in her bed. At dawn, she walked the rows and counted the damage. 11 trees had lost major limbs. Old Pardon had split further down its ancient divide, and one half lay on the ground like a fallen soldier, the exposed heartwood pale and shocked-looking in the gray morning light. She sat down in the frozen grass next to the fallen half of Old Pardon and pressed her forehead against the cold bark. The resort's main building was visible now, through the bare winter trees on the ridge, a massive structure of stone and glass that glowed with warm light. She could hear the faint sound of machinery, always machinery, and somewhere a radio playing music that didn't belong in this valley. She thought about the money. She thought about a warm apartment somewhere in the city where nothing depended on her, where nothing died because she wasn't strong enough to save it. She thought about giving up. Then she looked at the fallen limb more closely. There, along its length, were the swollen buds of next spring's blossoms. The tree had been preparing for another year even as the ice was taking it apart. It was still trying. It didn't know how to do anything else. She stood up. She got a saw and a pot of grafting wax, and she spent the rest of the day cutting clean wounds and sealing them. She splinted old Pardon's remaining trunk with a steel cable and a turnbuckle she'd salvaged from the barn. She did not think about the resort again that day. There was too much work. The years passed the way years do on a farm, not in dramatic leaps, but in slow, accumulating increments. The Grandview at Shenandoah opened in the spring of 1996, 5 years after the construction began. It was spectacular in the way that expensive things are spectacular, all imported stone and floor-to-ceiling windows, and a golf course so manicured it looked painted. They had a spa and a fine dining restaurant, and rooms that cost more per night than Briar made in a month. The parking lot filled with cars that gleamed like jewelry, and Briar's wall grew. The red cedars, the survivors of that brutal first year, were the advance guard. By year 4, they were taller than a man, their dense blue-green foliage forming a continuous screen along the northern boundary. Behind them, the Virginia pines were filling in, their softer needles creating a second layer of insulation that caught dust and muffled sound with surprising effectiveness. The dogwoods and reedbuds, still young, were beginning to bloom each spring in waves of white and pink that attracted clouds of pollinators. Bees and butterflies and hummingbirds that had been increasingly scarce during the construction years. But the real miracle was happening underground, exactly as Amos had predicted. The roots of 600 trees, reaching down through the fractured limestone, were finding water. The transpiration from their leaves was raising the humidity on her side of the ridge. The creek, which had been a sad trickle for years, began to recover. Not to its former glory, not yet, but enough. The well came up 6 feet. 6 feet of water that meant the difference between survival and failure for her oldest trees. The orchard responded the way living things respond when the pressure is finally lifted, slowly, gratefully, completely. The pippins recovered first, their fruit growing fat and crisp again, the juice running sweet and sharp when she cut one open on a September afternoon and held it to her nose and smelled the thing she'd been afraid she'd lost forever. The Arkansas blacks followed, dense as stones and twice as flavorful. The Grimes Goldens, those fragrant ghosts of a nearly extinct variety, bloomed so heavily in the 6th spring that the bees couldn't visit every flower, and the ground beneath the trees was carpeted in white petals like snow. Old Pardon, held together by steel cable and pure stubbornness, bore fruit that year for the first time since the ice storm. Only a few dozen apples, small and imperfect. Briar picked each one by hand and pressed them separately, and the juice that ran from the press was so golden and so concentrated in flavor that she set it aside in its own small barrel. She labeled it Pardon and decided she would never sell it. Her cider came back, not just came back. It came back deeper, more complex, as if the tree's suffering had added something to the fruit, a gravity, a seriousness that hadn't been there before. The wild yeast on the skins, fed by the diverse ecosystem the shelter belt was creating, produced flavors she'd never tasted. There were notes of honey and smoke, and something almost savory like fresh bread that she couldn't explain and didn't try to. She just let it be what it was. She sold it from the same shed at the end of the lane. She didn't advertise. She didn't have a website or a phone number. She had a hand-painted sign that said Dunham Cider and a metal cash box and the honor system. The prices were fair. The supply was limited. Some weeks it sold out by Tuesday. Some weeks it sat there. The first sign of the turning came quietly, the way all real changes do. A man named Philip Kessler, who wrote about food and drink for one of those glossy East Coast magazines that Breyer had never read, was a guest at the Grandview. He was there to review the resort for a travel piece, and he was bored. The restaurant served excellent food, technically flawless, sourced from approved purveyors in the usual way. The wine list was impressive. The cocktails were creative. Everything was beautiful, and nothing surprised him. On his third afternoon, restless and looking for a walk, he followed a gravel road that led away from the resort's groomed paths and found himself standing in front of a weathered shed with a hand-painted sign. He bought a bottle of cider and a jar of apple butter. He opened the cider in his room that evening and poured it into one of the resort's crystal glasses. And he sat very still for a long time after the first sip. The article appeared 2 months later. It was not primarily about the Grandview. It was about the cider. Kessler wrote about it the way people write about things that have changed their understanding of what is possible. He described the flavor profile in language that was almost musical. He wrote about the orchard, about the heritage varieties that existed nowhere else. He wrote about the contrast between the resort's polished perfection and the plain wooden shed, where a bottle of something extraordinary could be had for $8 on the honor system. He called Dunham Cider the most honest thing I have ever put in my mouth, and noted that it was available exclusively at a farm stand you could practically see from the resort's infinity pool, but that no one at the resort seemed to know existed. They knew after that. The concierge desk at the Grandview started fielding questions within a week of publication. Where is the Dunham farm? Can we get that cider at dinner? Does the restaurant carry it? The answers were no, no, and no. The resort's beverage director, a man who had spent his career building relationships with Napa vineyards and European importers, suddenly found himself being asked by guests paying $1,200 a night why he couldn't procure a bottle of apple cider from the farm next door. Let me tell you what happened next, because it is the part that Breyer herself still talks about with a quiet, private satisfaction that never quite reaches a smile. It was a late October afternoon, 10 years almost to the month since Mr. Voss had stood in her driveway and told her she was on the wrong side of progress. She was in the pressing barn, feeding apples into the old hand-cranked press, the sweet, sharp smell of fresh juice filling the air. She heard a car on the gravel. She did not stop pressing. Mr. Voss came to the barn door. He looked different. The suit was still expensive, but it fit differently, looser, as if something inside him had contracted. His shoes were different, too. Not Italian loafers, something sturdier with rubber soles. He had learned, at least, about the mud. "Miss Dunham," he said. "Mr. Voss." She did not stop cranking the press. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work, watching the dark amber juice flow into the collecting pan. "We seem to have a situation," he said. "Our guests have become very attached to your products. It's become something of a competitive issue for us. Other luxury properties in the region are marketing farm-to-table experiences, and we're losing bookings to resorts that can offer what we cannot pressing." "That does sound like a situation," Breyer said, still pressing. "We'd like to discuss a supply arrangement. Your cider and apple products featured in our restaurant and our gift shop. We would, of course, offer a premium wholesale rate." Breyer finally stopped cranking. She wiped her hands on her canvas apron and looked at him. "Mr. Voss, I seem to remember you telling me that an agricultural operation wasn't compatible with your vision." He had the decency to look at the ground. "My grandfather used to say that the land has a long memory," she said. "Turns out he was right about most things." She did not say yes that day. She told him she'd think about it, and she let him drive away on her gravel in his newer, more expensive car, and she finished pressing her apples in the quiet of the barn. She thought about it for 2 weeks. She consulted with a lawyer from Staunton, a sharp, patient woman who understood agricultural contracts and who looked at the situation and said, "You have all the leverage. Let's use it." The meeting took place at Breyer's kitchen table, not at the Grandview's conference room, not at a neutral location. At her table, the same scarred oak table where Aim Amos had eaten his meals for 50 years. Mr. Voss brought 2 lawyers. Breyer had her one. She served them cider in mason jars and watched them drink it. She watched the involuntary softening in their faces, the slight pause, the look that said, "This is not what I expected." Good. That was the point. The terms were not negotiable. Breyer would supply a fixed quantity of cider and apple products each week, determined by her based on what the trees produced and what she could press without mechanizing or rushing the process. The price was retail plus 30% for exclusivity and delivery. She would be the sole supplier of cider and apple products to the Grandview, and they would not source from any other orchard or cider maker within a 100-mile radius. Her name, Dunham Cider, Est. 1947, would appear on every menu and every label. She would retain complete control over production methods. No consultants, no efficiency experts, no suggestions about increasing yield, and one more thing. Her lawyer slid a document across the table. It was a conservation easement, drafted and ready for signature, covering not only Breyer's 80 acres, but an additional 200 acres of ridgeland that currently belonged to Ridgeline Partners. The easement would permanently prohibit development, blasting, and any alteration of the natural water table on that land. "Consider it a goodwill gesture," her lawyer said, "a sign that the Grandview values the natural environment that makes its location special." Mr. Voss's lawyers objected. They cited property rights, they cited fiduciary responsibility, they cited shareholder expectations. Breyer sipped her cider and waited. When they were finished, she looked at Mr. Voss. "Those are my terms," she said. "All of them. The guests aren't just buying cider, Mr. Voss. They're buying the story of where it comes from. If that story changes, the cider doesn't taste the same. Trust me on that." He looked at her across the table. He looked out the window at the orchard, the ancient trees heavy with fruit, the deep green wall of the shelter belt rising on the ridge behind them. So thick and tall, now that his resort was completely invisible from where they sat. He had tried to erase this place, and instead it had become the thing his guests valued most. He was paying for authenticity, and she was setting the price. He signed. The decades that followed were quiet, in the way that good lives are quiet. The contract held through 3 changes of resort ownership, each new management team inheriting the Dunham supply agreement as a sacred, immovable feature of their operation. The Grandview's marketing eventually made the partnership a centerpiece of their brand, home of the legendary Dunham Cider, their brochures said. "A living heritage, steps from your door." They had tried to remove her, and now they were selling her as their greatest asset. Breyer appreciated the irony, but did not dwell on it. She had trees to tend. She never expanded. She never mechanized. She never took on debt. The money from the contract was good, steady money, and she used it the way Amos would have. She bought more land, not to farm, but to protect. She placed it all into conservation trusts with ironclad provisions that would outlive her and her children's children. The shelter belt matured into a genuine forest, so rich in biodiversity that a university botanist who came to study it found 3 species of native orchid that hadn't been documented done in the Shenandoah Valley in over 40 years. Old Pardon lived, against all reason and arboricultural logic. That split, cable-braced, stubbornly productive tree continued to bear fruit for another 25 years. Its apples were never abundant and never perfect, but the cider pressed from them, that small barrel labeled Pardon that Briar made each year and never sold, was the finest thing she ever produced. She gave jars of it to people she loved on occasions that mattered. It was not a commercial product. It was a sacrament. When she was in her 60s, Briar began to receive visitors of a different kind. Not tourists, not food writers, but young people. Young farmers, young orchardists, young people who had inherited land or bought land or were thinking about buying land and who faced the same pressures she had faced. The developers, the offers, the well-meaning advice to sell, to cash out, to be practical. They came to her the way pilgrims come to a shrine, looking not for miracles, but for proof that the thing they wanted to do was possible. She would walk with them through the orchard, past General and the Jury and Old Pardon, with its steel cable and its stubborn crown of leaves. She would take them to the edge of the shelter belt and let them stand in the sudden hush that fell. When you stepped beneath those trees, the noise of the modern world dropping away like a coat slipping off your shoulders. She'd let them feel it before she said anything. Everyone will tell you to be realistic, she'd say, her voice carrying the same rough gentleness that Amos's had. They'll tell you the numbers don't work, that you can't compete, that you're being sentimental. And maybe they're right about the numbers. Numbers are easy to be right about, but they're measuring the wrong thing. She'd put her hand on the bark of a white oak, one of the 50 she'd planted as a sapling no bigger than her arm, now a tree so large 2 people couldn't reach around it. They measure what a thing is worth today. They don't know how to measure what it will be worth in 50 years if you just leave it alone and let it grow. That's not a calculation. That's an act of faith. And faith is the one thing they can never put a price on, which is exactly why it's the most valuable thing you own. On a bright September morning, when the orchard was heavy with fruit and the air smelled the way it had smelled every September of her life, Briar sat on the porch with her niece's daughter, a quiet girl of 19 with dirt under her fingernails and a serious expression that reminded Briar so much of Amos it made her chest ache. She handed the girl the journal from 1963, its leather cover soft as cloth from decades of handling. "This is yours now," Briar said. "Don't just read it. Listen to it. Your grandfather's grandfather drew those plans, and they saved everything. The land will always tell you what it needs if you're patient enough to hear it. The world will always come knocking with a better offer. Let it knock. You just keep pressing apples." The girl took the journal carefully. The way you hold something that is both fragile and indestructible, and she opened it to the first page, where Amos Dunham had written in his neat, deliberate hand, "The patient thing will always outlast the powerful thing. Plant accordingly." Mr. Voss, who had told a young woman standing in her own orchard that she was on the wrong side of progress, retired years ago to a condominium in Scottsdale. The Grand View at Shenandoah is on its 4th ownership group. The golf course has been redesigned twice. The spa has been renovated 3 times. But the Dunham cider is still on the menu, still pressed by hand, still made from fruit that grows on trees planted by a man who came home from a war and decided the only sane thing to do was grow something. The cider tastes the same as it always has, which is to say, it tastes like a place that refused to become anything other than what it was.